talking about basically how to budget your project and how that is a key component to cost management and cost controls. And then ease into things like what kind of processes can you put in place for time and expense, because those are actually costs that you have to consider, and what you can help the PMs with as far as how they approach the management style or the methodology that you're using in the system. And we'll wrap up with talking about some change orders and processes considering for that. So the budgeting process for PMs, it's never really too early to start looking at the cost aspect of budgeting. And really, when people are doing estimates for pipeline or for pre-sales or sales opportunities, cost is part of the equation. You're doing your estimate, you're doing your scoping, you're figuring out what's going to be delivered to a customer, and then from that, you're figuring out what kind of resources do you need, how much of their time do you need, and all those resources and labor people have a labor cost associated with them. Whether you're planning on using internal resources or external resources, they're a cost to the company. So we have to understand what that cost is in scoping the engagement. The travel costs are often estimated, and those costs are something that are hard costs. When you're talking about labor costs, if you're talking about internal resources, those resources have a cost to the company, but they're soft costs. We have some capabilities to sort of move people around. Hard costs are when there's cash out the door from the company to buy external labor, and of course travel costs also falls into that. Then there's material and hardware costs potentially, where you're having to buy servers or ship things via FedEx, or those are all things that, again, money out the door from the company, so it's a hard cost, and that's all part of the scoping aspect of the project. So before the PM even gets it, before we even spend a dollar, we really want to understand what the plan is, what the plan of the cost is. And it could be something as simple as, just total cost. I need, $15,000 of resource labor. I need $10,000 of travel, and I need, $50 worth of FedEx. But a more sophisticated version of this would be to plan out cost as a duration of the project, and that's where PMs can get involved. So from a pre-sale scoping perspective, you're scoping cost at a total value. The PMs get a hold of it, and the first thing that I recommend PMs always do when they're taking on a new project, confirm what the SOW is, understand what the SOW is, and then re-plan out exactly what was estimated. Understand where did they come up with $15,000 for labor. If you planned it out, would you come up with that same number? And that is really part of the early project kickoff, but it's also part of the risk assessment piece, I think, for PMs, because a PM right off the gate, if they're seeing a mismatch in numbers, they're expecting to spend 3 times the labor cost or 5 times the travel cost. Huge red flag right out the gate. Hey, I need someone to confirm and help me understand why are my estimates very different from what was sold to the customer, and where are there caveats or controls in the way the SOW is written so that I have a way to do change orders to get more funding if we go over this budget. Okay, so way back at the beginning, before you spend a dollar, the scoping has to be accurate, and then as part of the the kickoff and the selling, the PM should reconfirm everything and come up with a plan. That's the first visible point, I think, of the cost in an organization to help you get some kind of understanding to implement controls. Now that's all well and good, and you can say, Jody, that's great. At the beginning I had this great plan, but planning is one thing and execution is completely different. So we all know there's the perfect plan, and then there's what actually happened. In many cases, what you expect to do as far as labor, you end up having to use contractors instead of resources internally, because timing is everything, and suddenly the person you expected to use is out for personal reasons or out on another project, or their other project got delayed, so now you're having to scramble and find somebody to fill the role. And then using a contractor in some companies is more expensive, and in some companies it's less expensive. So there's always a pro and con with that. And then what if you run into situations where you're expecting to travel more often to the customer, you're flying people in from remote areas that have a little higher cost when it comes to airfare, maybe some emergency meetings where there's last-minute airfare booked, and we all know that that's a high cost. So the budgeting process gives you the plan, and then trying to check that burn along the way gives you the second visibility option as you're running a project, is understanding how am I doing against my plan. And as things start to deviate or the variance starts to grow, that's red flags that you can keep management and the customer aware of. Customer, not labor costs, but expense costs. Keep people aware of from a communication so there's no surprises and there's actions to be able to help control that cost wherever possible. Now, when you have a subcontractor approval process in place, or you need to have a subcontractor brought on board, I do recommend you have some kind of approval process. Don't let the PM go out and just find somebody and hire them in and start using them. Should have some kind of approval process. Procurement, of course, gets involved. But that approval process should have a workflow where before you just do the knee-jerk reaction to say, I need a subcontractor, go find somebody down the street, stop and look at, where are the other resources within the organization. Many of you on the phone are in multi-department, multi-office, multi-country type companies where you do have resources at your fingertips, and they may actually already know a lot of what you need them to know. They just don't happen to be in your neck of the woods. So any kind of labor cost control that has the potential to bring subcontractors on board, the first step should really be, do we have someone in-house that can do it? And if we do, let's use that resource, because that's a soft cost, and that makes your team, your employees more utilized, which gives you a better bottom line dollar value, okay? However, if you do have to use subcontractors, you'll have to go back and look at how that hits your budget. The subcontractor may be 3 times the cost of an internal resource. And if that's the case, you really have to make sure that person that you're bringing on board is either A, very productive, so they're spending less hours, so the cost evens out, or there's an understanding in the organization, in the company, that you have to bring the contractor on. This is a critical project, and therefore we have to take the hit on margin because we need to use this resource. Definitely any kind of subcontractor approval process it should have at least that checkpoint to say what long-term will happen to the project margin when we bring that subcontractor on board. So first and foremost, if you want to control labor costs, you have to understand if you're missing a resource, where can you get it? And the low-cost option is always the first option. Check in-house. If you can't find someone in-house, you go to the subcontractor route. The subcontractor route should have a checkpoint to say, what is that going to do to the margin? So again, communication and awareness. So this is the third level of visibility, is that the subcontractor approval process is making sure that there's a cost awareness for controls in the system. Now, from a cost visibility, when I started getting involved in professional services many years ago, the labor cost was, to me, it was just cost. I need to understand what the cost of the resource is, and as a PM, you're told a cost number. When in fact, there's actually, that cost number, you're just taking that at face value. There's a few different methods that I've run into over my career that the PMs are empowered to do cost management, and there's little nuances here. So the first one I call is net zero revenue. The second one is banded cost. The third one is seeing people's actual cost, and the fourth one is seeing actual cost with adjustment to salary. Okay, and really the major differences between these four, the net zero revenue approach, you're not actually giving PMs the potential to see cost. What you're asking PMs to do is manage to a net zero revenue, which means you're giving people a bill rate, not a cost rate, a bill rate, and that bill rate is what all the hours are computed against. And the goal for the PM is to hit the revenue number. So if the project is valued at $25,000, their job is to hit 25,000. If they come in at 2450 or 24,500, they came in under margin, they came in at a higher margin. If they go over the 25,000, they're eating into margin, but they're not actually seeing real margin. They're just managing to the actual budget of the project. So this cost management approach isn't really a cost management approach because you're not giving any visibility to the PMs. The hour of a resource is really being driven by a bill rate. So if you wanted to make it sort of a cost equivalent, you have to make the bill rates reflect sort of, that you use subcontractors. Their bill rate is much higher than an internal resource that would have a lower rate. And that's kind of a hard concept to be consistent on. So what you end up doing is you end up saying, well, this contractor is billing out the same as my internal people. So you sort of lose all the visibility to cost management in this case. So this is good when there's, kind of probably small projects or you have major concerns about, cost sharing. But the net zero revenue is not really a cost management approach for margin. So you're not going to have a lot of controls to control cost. The banded cost, however, this is a pretty popular one for PMs. What banded cost means is, I like to call it directionally correct margin, where you have the cost of the resource is the same if everyone is the same category. So let's say we have a technical architect. Everyone who's a technical architect is the same cost. Now, in reality, we all know not everyone gets the same salary, depending on your title. So it's a way to share a level of cost, but it's not an extremely accurate cost management. But it's still worthwhile because banded cost also exposes a cost value. So you know that if you use a technical architect to do documentation, you're probably using a higher cost type resource from the organization than somebody who's a tech writer. Okay. With banded cost, you also tend to let the PM see the actual cost of contractors because they may be involved in the contractor or vendor procurement process. So this does have a flavor of actual cost, but that's because they're probably involved in negotiating and trying to get the subcontractor on board. So this is a popular one because it's giving people directionally correct margin, directionally correct cost control with the ability to see actual costs from vendors, which is where the cost control really needs to focus. Now, the third option is actual cost. The third and fourth options are very much related to each other. The actual cost and actual cost with adjustments. This is where we're actually sharing a cost value that is related to salary in some manner. And I'm being very specific on how I say that because it's not salary. There's benefits and bonuses and all taxes and all that kind of stuff that get impacted here. So this actual cost tends to be like a loaded cost value. Now, the two flavors here are really when you want to start looking at, I want spot-on margin, I want spot-on cost control, and the actual cost, if we look at it from like an hourly perspective, if somebody works 60 hours in a week, that's 60 hours of cost, when they're probably a salary resource and they're only having to get paid for 40 hours. So that's what the second version of this is we're basically allowing those 60 hours to have the cost equivalent of 40. So you're doing a cost adjustment. Now, there's a big caution in using these two. Not only are you exposing salary information to the PMs, so obviously there's some sensitivity there, but the other thing is if you're using the actual cost with adjustment, you could actually be thinking you're controlling costs, but you're burning your resources out because you're spending too many hours. So although that's a cost management approach, is like, work your people to death, I wouldn't recommend it because the cost adjustment just sort of hides metrics. So if you're going to go with either approach, I like the banded cost approach. I think it's a very good cost management approach, giving people visibility to subcontractor costs, and just a little bit of caution with the actual cost approach. Now, of course, the hard cost is the expense cost. So the expense costs, everyone knows that's cash out of pocket. You have to reimburse your employees. You're hoping to get rebilling it back to customers. And if it's a pass-through always to a customer and there's payment with no question, this becomes less of an issue. But for many of us, there is cost in internal as well as within the project that you don't necessarily charge out. and internal costs that hit the bottom line. So make sure you have an expense policy. What are people allowed to spend on? Are there any limits? And make sure you have approvals of those limits. So, can people spend, how much is their daily set of meals? If you're in New York, is it the same as if you're in Jacksonville, Florida type thing? So what is the expense policy? And then if a customer has an expense policy, that also is something to factor in. So if the customer allows you to fly business class, but your company does not, how do you factor that cost in to the project? So make sure you have a policy, and make sure you have a system that helps you put controls in place, that helps you keep on top of your cost with approval processes, with features, maybe putting caps or limits, giving people approval authorities based on certain levels. All of those functions can help you with the expense cost of it, because you want to have some guidance so that people know what is allowed and what is not allowed in the system. Now, you certainly should have a timesheet and expense approval process. Now, I will be one of the first to say this is not a foolproof method. Timesheet and expense approval processes are there to make things visible, but people get busy and people will say, oh, yeah, look, I just have to hit approve 15 times and I'm done. Really emphasize that people look at the timesheets, look at the expenses, and make sure that they understand that that is translating to a cost to the company, and where are people spending their time, what kind of expenses are being charged, and having multiple people approve things is a way to catch mistakes or kind of keep on top of how can we make something, how can we reduce the cost to the company by avoiding people going out and buying their own office supplies, things like that. The approval workflow can also consider putting an approval workflow in place that also supports the ability of how much are people authorized to sign off on, especially when it comes to expenses. Maybe a project manager is given an authority level of approving $3,000 on any given expense report. If it goes beyond that, like international travel sometimes, it has to go to the department head or to finance or to some other person to make sure that that's a legitimate charge and that is something that is allowed to be recorded to the company. So having these sign-off approvals based on a cost level gives you visibility on an exception basis so that you can see if people are spending an exorbitant amount of money on their phone bill, for example, and you're charging that back to the company. There's some visibility as to why that cost is so high, and then being able to take action to make that a lower cost. Now, with the cost methodology approaches and then how to make things more visible, what you also want to do is you also want to give your project managers as many tools as they need to help themselves keep control of cost. So again, getting involved in the pipeline or the pre-sale stuff and doing the validation of the scoping at the very beginning, they should be able to lay out what the cost plan is. So if they have a tool like some kind of budget or a spreadsheet or something where they're laying out how they expect the burn of the project to go from a cost perspective, when they expect to spend money on travel and travel costs, right? That gives them a plan to continually measure against. So they can take that plan, they can baseline that plan. And from that plan, as they're executing, they're measuring their actuals as they're coming in. How much was this trip? Did that come in under budget or over budget? Are we consistently having to book high-priced hotels because we happen to go to San Francisco and nothing is cheap in San Francisco? So how am I doing against that? Because as you can compare it along the delivery of the project, you have a checkpoint for the PMs to be able to raise the red flags to say, hey, I'm burning hot, I've got lots of costs coming in, and I'm concerned about how we're going to be able to hit the margin that we originally estimated this project to be. If you start seeing a big variation from the plan of cost to the actual cost, that may give the PM the ability to start saying, okay, I need to put some change orders in place with the customer, especially when travel costs start getting higher. If the customer needs to approve expenses. They're approving higher price expenses, but we should still make sure we're thorough with the paperwork and get those change orders in place so that there's no surprises. Now, if the cost of the labor is starting to go high, you may not actually be able to do a change order with the customer because that might be an internal situation where you don't have resources or less expensive resources. You're using more expensive resources than you expected, so you're burning hot. That's an internal problem, and you have to go to your management to talk about that internal problem and how do you solve that. But if it's a customer that's asking, okay, well, we're now going to add XYZ integration in it, and it needs this type of technician, that certainly is a change order so that you can bring in additional revenue and additional cost to cover it. So the change orders, a change order, many times I'll see customers do like a $0 change order, and that's really just to make sure that we keep everything whole, that we know where budgets and hours and money is going to be put. But a change order process definitely needs to be put in place so that, A, there's an awareness and an acknowledgement that something has changed from the plan. When you have a change from the plan, a change order documents what happened, why did it happen, what's the overall impact, and who signs off and approves it. That last piece, the who signs off and approves it, is how you gain the visibility both internally to your company and, if necessary, externally to the customer, because you need to make sure that everyone understands why a change order had to happen. And if it does impact the revenue and the cost, you have a means to be able to adjust that baseline and take another baseline of your plan and then measure to that. The change orders give you that paper trail and that history that auditors are going to look for and say, well, why did you change this? The SOW says $15,000, but you ended up at $25,000, and the cost, you still hit the same margin, but you had twice as much travel costs. And then you can say, well, we ended up having to go on site 5 more times. Here's what we agreed upon with the customer. Here's the change order. They signed off on it, and we're good to go. Okay. I'm very big on communication. I'm very big on making sure there's an awareness of when there's a deviation from the plan, what kind of actions do you need to take, and who needs to be involved in that approval of that action. So really, when it comes to cost management for your professional services organization and how to manage that from a project perspective, everyone I think understands labor costs are a huge part of cost management. Now the labor costs themselves are difficult because you have to make a decision about how you expose that cost to the PM. How do you expose and track that cost in a way that helps the PM know whether they're on plan and that you still can come in at the margin that you did the original estimate at. Make sure you give your PMs the tools they need. Worst case, they pull out the spreadsheet, but the spreadsheet doesn't really travel very far. It stays on somebody's desktop most of the time. So look at tools like PSA tools, cloud-based tools, Google Sheets, things like that. Anything where you have a sharing opportunity, a collaboration opportunity, so that there's a way to have that information be visible. And make sure you have approval processes in place where there's checkpoints. You're having to report to a manager, you're having to report to a customer, you're having to sign off on timesheets and expenses. And if you get an expense that you didn't expect, it's because it's probably an exception going over some kind of threshold. Having those both documented process and then system-based processes really make sure that you're connecting everyone together that needs to be aware of the cost and how the spend is going. And make sure you establish policies, especially when it comes to expense reports. Expense reports themselves are something that there is a level of control to control costs there, but people will only control based on guidance that's given from the company or from the customer. So having those policies in place will do a lot of good in making sure that we're on track.